A lost brooch, unread letters, and a life built on lies. Chloe's unexpected arrival in the village will forever change the story of James, a man rejected by his past and haunted by scorn. James woke up each morning to the sound of birds that seemed oblivious to the harshness of his routine. The small village on the edge of the forest was quaint, with cobbled streets hiding secrets at every corner, but none as painful as the ones James carried. His home, a weathered cabin worn down by time, mirrored his existence, forgotten, abandoned, and crumbling slowly. He lived with little, very little, and every day was a struggle to endure the indifference surrounding him. The people in the village, though neighbors, were emotionally miles apart. To them, James was nothing more than a grumpy old man stubbornly clinging to a place where he wasn't welcome. Whispered comments and judgmental glances followed him whenever he dared step into the town square. Children avoided him, and adults pretended not to see him. It was easier that way, to ignore a man who, to all appearances, had no purpose anymore. But James had a secret. Hidden in a wooden box under his bed were memories of a time when he was loved, respected, and, above all, happy. Faded photographs and a brooch with an engraved inscription were all that remained of a past that felt like it belonged to another life. He spent hours staring at those keepsakes, trying to piece together fragments of a happiness that now felt like a distant dream. Tom, however, was unforgiving. Hunger began to gnaw at him, and the few coins he had were quickly dwindling. James had always taken pride in his independence, even if it was an illusion. Asking for help was a thought he avoided at all costs. But that morning, something inside him shifted. Perhaps it was his empty stomach or the suffocating silence of solitude. As he walked toward the center of the village, James felt the weight of his years on his shoulders. He had avoided this path for months, perhaps years. The forest had been his sanctuary, where he could hide from hostility, but he could no longer ignore his need. The local bakery was his destination, and he knew he wouldn't be greeted with open arms. Yet he had to try. The village's idyllic scenery might charm an outsider. Flowers adorning windowsills, the scent of fresh bread wafting through the air. But for James, it was a cruel reminder of everything he lacked. As he approached the bakery, his legs faltered. It was as if he were about to enter a battle for which he had no weapons. People passing by glanced at James briefly but quickly turned their eyes away. His presence felt like an annoyance, a reminder of something they didn't want to confront. He knew the whispers would begin as soon as he entered the bakery. He had always known. But that day, he had no choice. Reaching the entrance, James hesitated. The wooden door stood ajar, revealing the cozy warmth inside and sunlight glinting off the counter. He could hear laughter, conversations, and the clinking of cups. Everything seemed so distant, so unattainable. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside, feeling the stares immediately land on him. For a moment, the room fell silent, as if time itself had paused. Then came the murmurs, whispers that quickly morphed into silent judgments. James kept his head down, trying to ignore the discomfort. He knew this moment would be the beginning of something. He just didn't know what. As soon as James stepped into the bakery, the aroma of freshly baked bread filled his senses, but it brought no comfort. Instead, it served as a cruel reminder of everything he lacked. The room, previously filled with laughter and chatter, fell into an awkward silence. The customers turned to stare, some with curiosity, others with disdain. He didn't need to meet their eyes to know what they were murmuring about him. Stubborn old man, doesn't he have any shame? What's he doing here? Each word felt like a thorn piercing his skin. James tried to maintain his composure. Walking slowly, he made his way to the counter. The few coins he held trembled slightly in his hand, betraying his nerves. He knew this moment would not be easy, but hunger drove him to try. Amanda, the bakery's owner, spotted James as soon as he walked in. Her narrowed eyes were filled with disapproval. Crossing her arms, she positioned herself behind the counter like a barrier between James and what he needed. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, Amanda had already decided how this interaction would end. I thought you'd learn to stay away, she said, her icy tones slicing through the room. Shame washed over James. He tried to swallow the words he wanted to say, but his throat felt like it was tied in knots. "Just a piece of bread," he murmured, barely audible. The coins in his hand caught the sunlight streaming through the windows, appearing as insignificant as he felt. Amanda let out a bitter laugh that echoed through the bakery's silence. "With those little coins? What do you think this is, a charity?" Amanda snapped, her voice dripping with contempt. The customers laughed nervously, as if trying to mask their discomfort while still enjoying the spectacle. James felt the weight of all the stares pressing down on him, as if he were on trial with no defense. His stomach growled loudly, betraying the dignity he tried so hard to preserve. He clenched the coins tighter in his hand, feeling the cold metal against his skin. "I just wanted," he began, but Amanda interrupted him again, stepping forward and shaking her head impatiently. "What you want is trouble. Get up, James. We don't have anything for you here," she said, gesturing dramatically toward the door. He hesitated, looking around for something, anything, that might help him. But all he found were faces turning away, pretending not to hear or see what was happening. The humiliation was almost unbearable. His body felt heavy, as though each cruel word from Amanda was forming invisible chains around him. The coins slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, the sound louder than it should have been. He didn't bend down to pick them up. Instead, he turned slowly, ready to leave. Amanda stepped back, satisfied with her victory. The sound of the door opening marked the end of a bitter chapter in James's life. Yet, just as he was about to step outside, something changed. A different presence emerged from the murmurs and contempt. A woman, elegantly dressed and with an air of quiet determination, was sitting at a nearby table. Chloe had been watching the entire scene unfold. Rising from her seat, she adjusted her coat and began walking toward James. James sensed Chloe's presence before he even saw her approaching. Her confident steps and the faint rustle of her coat cut through the heavy silence of the bakery. Yet, he hesitated to look at her. The shame he carried burned like invisible embers on his skin. He had convinced himself that no one would help him, least of all someone who appeared to belong to a world so far removed from his own. "Can I help?" Chloe asked, her voice clear yet gentle, carrying a kindness that took James by surprise. Slowly, he raised his eyes to meet hers. Something in her gaze disarmed him, but even so, he couldn't bring himself to accept her help. "We don't want to cause trouble," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. The words reflected years of rejection and a life spent trying not to be noticed. Chloe stood firm, unflinching. "Trouble? I think the only one troubled here isn't us," she said, throwing a pointed look at Amanda. The bakery owner narrowed her eyes, clearly annoyed by Chloe's interruption. "He was just leaving," Amanda interjected, trying to regain control. But Chloe wasn't deterred. She turned back to James, her expression soft but unwavering. "You don't need to leave like this. Let me help you," she said, extending a hand, not just to offer assistance, but to lift him from the depths of humiliation. James hesitated again. The coins still lay scattered on the floor, catching the sunlight like tiny accusations. He felt the weight of every eye on him, waiting to see what he would do. To accept her help would mean admitting his vulnerability, something he had spent a lifetime avoiding. But Chloe's presence was unlike anything he'd encountered in years. There was a sincerity in her that made him pause. "I don't have enough money," he finally murmured, unable to meet her gaze. The words came out fragile, small, yet they carried the weight of his entire existence. Chloe bent down without hesitation, picking up the coins from the floor. She placed them gently in his hand, her touch steady. "Maybe you don't," she said, her voice calm. "But that doesn't mean you don't deserve help." Her words lingered in the air, wrapping around James like a protective cloak. Amanda let out an exaggerated sigh, crossing her arms. "If you want to pay for him, be my guest," she said with dripping sarcasm. Chloe remained unbothered, her calm demeanor unshaken. She turned to the counter, ordered a loaf of bread, and placed the money down with deliberate firmness, making it clear she would tolerate no further disrespect. Even with the bread in his hands, James stood frozen, as if waiting for the kindness to vanish or the humiliation to return. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice trembling. The question came from a place deep within, where fear had long told him that every kind gesture carried a hidden cost. Chloe tilted her head slightly, her smile softening. "Because no one deserves to be treated this way," she replied simply, her tone carrying a conviction that hit James like a tidal wave. She wasn't just offering him bread, she was offering him dignity. For a fleeting moment, something stirred inside him, a faint glimmer of trust. As he held the loaf, James felt torn between gratitude and disbelief. Chloe waited patiently, as if giving him the space to process what had just unfolded. Slowly, he took a step back toward the door, uncertain of what would come next. But Chloe wasn't finished. She gestured to a nearby table and said, "Sit with me for a while. Let's talk." The air hung heavy with possibilities as James stood there, unsure whether to stay or go. And for the first time in years, he felt that maybe, just maybe, someone saw him, not as a burden, but as a man worth helping. Chloe's eyes remained steady on James as he clutched the bread in his hands, a mix of gratitude and discomfort written across his face. Something in her gaze seemed to search for answers, as though trying to understand why a man like him had been left to face such indignities alone. Meanwhile, Amanda stood stiffly behind the counter, her disapproval radiating silently. But Chloe didn't waver. It was as if she had arrived at that moment with a purpose neither she nor James fully understood yet. "Please, sit with me for a moment," Chloe said, motioning to a nearby table by the window. James hesitated, his instinct urging him to decline. Accepting such kindness felt foreign, almost threatening, after years of rejection. He glanced at the bread, then toward the door, contemplating an escape. But Chloe's expression was patient, offering, not pressuring. After a few agonizing moments, he nodded hesitantly and followed her to the table. The table itself was ordinary, but the act of sitting there with Chloe felt like an extraordinary leap for James. He placed the bread down carefully, treating it as though it were fragile. Sensing his unease, Chloe broke the silence. "You must have known this bakery for years," she remarked casually, though she already guessed his visits were rare. "Not exactly," James replied, his voice low, as though every word required effort. "That's a shame," Chloe said. "A place like this should be welcoming to everyone." Her tone was calm but carried a subtle firmness. She wasn't just talking about the bakery, she was addressing the way James had been treated. He didn't respond immediately, only shrugging slightly, as though resigned to the indifference he had faced for so long. Yet, there was something in his silence, a trace of longing for a time when things might have been different. Chloe continued to speak, easing the tension by discussing lighter topics: the weather, the flowers in the village square, even the tantalizing smell of freshly baked goods. Slowly, James began to respond, his answers brief but less guarded. He spoke of his mornings spent tending to the modest garden behind his cabin, where flowers grew despite his calloused hands and limited resources. "You have a garden?" Chloe asked, her interest genuine. "I do. It's nothing special," he replied, his gaze dropping to his hands as though they betrayed his words. But Chloe saw something else. She saw a man who, despite life's harshness, still nurtured beauty in his small corner of the world. It touched her more than she expected. As they spoke, Chloe's eyes caught a glimmer on James's worn coat. A small brooch, tarnished with age but still holding a distinct charm, was pinned to the fabric. Its intricate design seemed to capture the sunlight streaming through the window. Chloe's heart skipped a beat. There was something hauntingly familiar about it, a ghost from her past she wasn't yet ready to confront. "That brooch, it's lovely," Chloe said, her voice light but tinged with curiosity. James seemed surprised that she noticed. "It was my son's," he said, his voice faltering slightly. The atmosphere in the bakery shifted once again, the air growing heavier with the weight of his words. Chloe didn't reply immediately, but her thoughts were racing. The brooch had stirred something deep within her, something she hadn't thought about in years. For a moment, the connection between them deepened in ways neither had anticipated. James, who had walked into the bakery invisible and defeated, now felt the faintest flicker of being seen. Chloe, initially moved by empathy, began to feel that her presence there was no mere coincidence. Somehow, the threads of their lives seemed to be weaving together in ways neither could yet understand. The conversation lingered, soft and deliberate, as though both were afraid to break whatever fragile bond was forming. But the brooch, a small and unassuming object, loomed large between them, its significance yet to be fully uncovered. And though James and Chloe left the bakery that day with more questions than answers, they both felt, for the first time in years, that this might be the start of something extraordinary. The next morning, sunlight filtered through a veil of mist that blanketed the village. James stood at the edge of his small garden, nervously adjusting his worn coat. The modest space, surrounded by resilient flowers and shrubs, was the only part of his life that felt truly his. He had agreed to let Chloe visit, though the idea filled him with unease. He wasn't used to sharing this sanctuary, least of all with someone who seemed so different from him. Chloe arrived shortly after, her graceful steps echoing down the quiet path leading to his cabin. This time, she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was Mateo, her teenage nephew, whose curious eyes darted around as if he were trying to take in every detail of the garden at once. "This is Mateo," Chloe said warmly, gesturing to the boy. "He insisted on coming to see your garden." James hesitated, unsure of how to respond, but nodded in acknowledgement. As they stepped into the garden, Chloe began to admire the plants. "These flowers are beautiful," she said, crouching down to inspect a patch of daisies. Mateo, more animated, pointed at a small tree laden with green leaves. "Did you plant this yourself?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. James glanced at the boy, caught off guard by his enthusiasm. "Plants don't ask for much," he muttered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "They give back more than they take." For a while, the three wandered the garden, their conversations meandering like the winding paths James had created. Chloe asked thoughtful questions about the flowers, while Mateo marveled at the patience and care needed to keep them alive. James, though reserved, found himself speaking more freely than he had in years. But the peace was interrupted when a neighbor carrying a bundle of firewood passed by, throwing a sharp glance in James's direction. The man muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Why waste time here?" The words, laced with disdain, cut through the moment like a blade. James stiffened, his gaze dropping to the ground. The shame and isolation he had worked so hard to forget began to creep back. But before he could retreat into silence, Chloe stepped forward, her voice calm yet firm. "Isn't it curious how some people spend so much time worrying about others' lives instead of tending to their own?" she said, her words landing with precision. The neighbor grumbled something unintelligible and walked away, leaving an uneasy silence in his wake. James, still tense, looked at Chloe, his face a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Chloe turned to him, her expression softening. "No one should have to endure that alone," she replied. Her words lingered in the air, offering comfort that James wasn't sure how to accept. Despite Chloe's reassurance, James still battled with his own doubts. The warmth of her presence and Mateo's light-hearted chatter were at odds with the years of rejection he'd endured. Accepting kindness was harder than he thought. Yet, something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just about the flowers or the garden. It was about the possibility of opening a door he had long kept shut. Mateo, sensing the tension, changed the subject. "You know, my uncle says gardens are like living books, full of stories waiting to be read," he said with a grin. James chuckled softly, the boy's energy easing the weight in the air. "Well, this garden's got a few stories, that's for sure," James replied, his voice carrying a hint of pride that surprised even himself. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Chloe glanced at the brooch pinned to James's coat. She had noticed it again, its intricate design catching the light. She wanted to ask more about it, but the moment didn't feel right. Instead, she smiled and said, "Your garden is remarkable, James. Thank you for sharing it with us." James nodded, his hands clasped tightly together. "You're welcome. I suppose it's nice to have someone see it." As Chloe and Mateo prepared to leave, James stood at the edge of his garden, watching them disappear down the path. He couldn't shake the feeling that their visit had planted something new within him, something unfamiliar but hopeful. And as the evening shadows crept into the garden, James looked around, seeing his small sanctuary in a new light. The following day, the sun rose shyly, its light cutting through the lingering mist that clung to the village. James stood in his garden, adjusting the soil around a patch of roses, his hands trembling slightly with the weight of anticipation. Chloe had promised to return with Mateo, and although he wouldn't admit it aloud, he found himself looking forward to their visit. For a man so used to solitude, the idea of companionship felt both comforting and foreign. True to her word, Chloe arrived just before noon, Mateo at her side, carrying a small notebook. "I brought this to sketch your garden," the boy announced, his excitement evident. James raised an eyebrow, his skepticism softened by Mateo's infectious enthusiasm. "Sketching, huh? Never thought anyone would find this place worth putting on paper," James replied. Mateo grinned. "Are you kidding? This place is amazing." As they worked together in the garden, James found himself talking more than usual. He explained the care needed for each plant, the seasons when they thrived, and even shared a few stories about the challenges of keeping them alive. Mateo listened intently, occasionally jotting notes or doodling in his notebook. Chloe observed quietly, her presence a steady anchor in the unfolding scene. But not everyone in the village was pleased with James's newfound company. While tending to the flowers, James noticed Amanda passing by, her expression cold and disapproving. She lingered just long enough to catch Chloe's attention, muttering, "What's the point of all this? A waste of time." James flinched at the remark, his confidence retreating as quickly as it had emerged. Chloe, however, wouldn't let the comment go unanswered. "It's curious how some people can't see the beauty in what others create," she said, her voice calm but piercing. Amanda hesitated, clearly taken aback, before muttering something under her breath and walking away. James looked at Chloe, his face a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. "You didn't have to say anything," he murmured. "Maybe not," she replied, "but no one has the right to take away what little piece you've built." Despite Amanda's bitterness, not everyone in the village shared her sentiment. A few neighbors, intrigued by the sight of Chloe and Mateo regularly visiting James's garden, began to approach hesitantly. Some came to admire the flowers, others brought small gifts like seeds or gardening tools, as if to contribute to the growing haven. For James, these small acts of kindness were tests of his ability to trust again, and though difficult, he found himself slowly accepting them. Mateo quickly became one of James's greatest allies. The boy's energy and curiosity seemed endless, and his admiration for James was unfiltered. "You know, you've probably forgotten more about plants than most people will ever know," Mateo said one afternoon, as he watered a row of lavender. James chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know about that, kid. I just do what I can to keep things alive." Chloe, too, was a steady presence, offering encouragement and a listening ear whenever James felt overwhelmed by the judgment of others. She often reminded him that the garden was more than a collection of plants. It was a symbol of resilience and growth. "This place is a reflection of you, James," she said one day, kneeling beside him to plant a new flower. "It shows that even in the hardest soil, beauty can take root." Yet, James still wrestled with his own inner doubts. The years of rejection and isolation weren't easy to forget, and there were moments when he questioned whether the changes in his life were real or fleeting. "What if this doesn't last?" he asked Chloe one evening, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "What if people stop caring again?" Chloe placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Even if they do, you've already proven to yourself that you're more than their judgment," she said firmly. As the days turned into weeks, the garden began to flourish, mirroring the changes within James. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, and new plants sprouted where the soil had once been barren. Mateo's sketches filled his notebook, and Chloe's visits became an anchor for James's growing sense of belonging. Still, a quiet tension lingered between James and Chloe, rooted in the brooch on his coat, a silent question neither had yet dared to fully confront. That evening, after a long day in the garden, James sat alone in his cabin. The brooch pinned to his coat seemed to weigh heavier than usual. He removed it carefully, holding it up to the dim light of the room. It was a simple piece, worn with time but unmistakably significant. His fingers traced the delicate engravings as memories of his son, Thomas, flooded back. The brooch had been Thomas's most prized possession, a family heirloom passed down for generations. Meanwhile, Chloe walked back to the inn where she was staying, her thoughts racing. The brooch on James's coat had caught her eye once again during their visit to the garden. There was no mistaking it. It was identical to the one Thomas had worn. The memories she had carefully tucked away for years began to surface, each one louder and more persistent than the last. She needed answers but wasn't sure how to ask the questions. The following morning, Chloe returned to James's cabin, this time alone. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the door. When James opened it, he looked at her with a mix of surprise and curiosity. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. No. Come in," James replied, stepping aside to let her in. He had a feeling this wasn't just a casual visit. Inside, the cabin was simple but full of character. Wooden shelves lined with books and small trinkets told stories of a life lived quietly. On the table sat a wooden box, its lid slightly ajar, revealing letters and photographs inside. Chloe's eyes lingered on it, her curiosity piqued. "You've kept a lot of memories," she said softly, gesturing toward the box. James nodded, his face clouded with emotion. "Memories are all I have left," he murmured. As Chloe sat at the table, her eyes caught sight of the brooch once more. Gathering her courage, she spoke. "That brooch, it's familiar. May I ask where it came from?" James stiffened slightly but didn't look away. "It belonged to my son, Thomas," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. Chloe's breath caught. She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly together. "Thomas was your son?" she asked, her voice trembling. James's brow furrowed as he studied her expression. "You knew him?" he asked cautiously. Chloe nodded, her eyes glistening. "I loved him," she said simply, the weight of those words filling the room. The revelation left James speechless. For years, he had carried the burden of Thomas's memory alone, and now here was someone who shared that grief, a woman who had loved his son as deeply as he had. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, James broke it. "I didn't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. "He never told me about you." But then again, Thomas kept so much to himself. Chloe lowered her gaze, her heart aching at the thought of the man they both loved keeping so many secrets. "He had his reasons, I suppose," she said softly. "But I always wondered why he never came back." James motioned toward the wooden box on the table. "There are letters," he said, his voice barely audible. "Letters he wrote but never sent. Maybe they can give you the answers you're looking for." Chloe's hands trembled as she reached for the box. Inside, a bundle of envelopes lay neatly stacked, each bearing her name. She picked one up, her heart racing as she unfolded the paper. The words on the page seemed to leap out at her. Thomas's handwriting was unmistakable, his words full of love, regret, and longing. "I think of you every day," the letter read. "I wish I could go back and do things differently, but I'm not sure I deserve you." Tears streamed down Chloe's face as she read, her heart breaking anew. "He loved you," James said softly. "He just didn't know how to say it." The room grew quiet again as Chloe processed the weight of the letters, the memories, and the man sitting across from her. James watched her carefully, his own grief mirrored in her expression. For the first time, he felt less alone in his sorrow, as though sharing it with someone else lessened its burden. Yet, beneath the shared pain, there was a growing sense of connection, an understanding that neither of them had to carry this alone anymore. The room was steeped in a heavy silence as Chloe stared at the letters spread across the table. Each one felt like a fragment of a life she had once hoped to build with Thomas. The words on the pages were raw, filled with love and regret, and they echoed all the things he had never been able to tell her. "He carried so much pain," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling. James nodded, his own shoulders sagging under the weight of years of guilt. "He never let anyone see it, but I knew it was there." Chloe folded one of the letters carefully, her hands still shaking. "Why didn't he send these? Why did he hold it all back?" she asked, her voice rising with a mix of anguish and frustration. James sighed, looking at the floor as though the answer might be written there. He was afraid, James said quietly. Afraid of not being enough for you. Afraid of failing again. Chloe felt tears welling up, but this time they were laced with anger. But by holding back, he hurt us both, she said, her voice cracking. I would have understood. I would have stood by him. James looked at her, his own eyes glassy. I know, he said softly. And I should have told him that. But I thought it wasn't my place. For years, James had wrestled with his own role in Thomas's choices. He had watched his son retreat into himself, burdened by fears James couldn't quite reach. I should have done more, James admitted, his voice breaking. I thought giving him space was the right thing to do, but now I see it only made things worse. I failed him as a father. Chloe placed a hand on James's, her touch firm yet gentle. You didn't fail him, James, she said. You loved him in the way you knew how. Just as he loved us both, even if he couldn't show it. Her words hung in the air, offering a fragile bridge between their shared guilt and their shared love for Thomas. As the day wore on, Chloe and James sifted through the contents of the wooden box. The letters were joined by photographs, images of Thomas as a boy, as a teenager, and finally as the man Chloe had fallen in love with. One photo in particular caught her eye. Thomas, holding the brooch that now rested on James's coat. He used to tell me it was a family treasure, Chloe said, tracing the edges of the photograph with her fingertips. And now it's all that's left. James looked at the brooch, then back at Chloe. It's more than that, he said. It's a reminder of him. Of who he was and what he meant to us. For the first time in years, James felt a small flicker of peace. Sharing these memories with Chloe felt like a step toward healing, not erasing the pain, but softening its edges. But healing didn't come without difficulty. As they talked late into the evening, Chloe found herself reliving the dreams she had shared with Thomas, and the pain of those unfulfilled promises threatened to overwhelm her. James, too, felt the weight of revisiting his regrets. It's like carrying a wound that never quite heals, James said. But maybe by sharing it, we can help each other bear the load. By the time Chloe left the cabin, the stars were beginning to emerge in the night sky. She paused at the doorway, looking back at James. This isn't the end of the story, she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. We still have a chance to honor him, to make sure he's remembered for who he truly was. James nodded, the brooch catching the faint starlight as he adjusted his coat. I'd like that, he said simply. As Chloe walked back toward the village, clutching the letters tightly, she felt a mix of grief and determination. The pain of losing Thomas would never fully fade, but for the first time, she saw a path forward, a way to turn that pain into something meaningful. And in James's small cabin, surrounded by memories and regret, the seeds of hope had finally begun to take root. The morning after their heartfelt exchange, the sun shone brighter than it had in weeks, casting a warm glow over James's small garden. He sat outside, the wooden box of Thomas's letters and photographs resting on a weathered table in front of him. For the first time in years, the memories felt less like a burden and more like pieces of a puzzle he was beginning to understand. Sharing them with Chloe had been painful, but it had also brought a sense of relief he hadn't thought possible. Chloe arrived not long after, carrying a basket filled with fresh bread and fruit. Her steps were lighter, as though some of the weight she had carried for so long had been lifted. Good morning, she greeted, setting the basket on the table. James gave her a faint smile. You didn't have to bring anything, he said, though his gratitude was evident. Of course I did, Chloe replied. We're in this together now. As they sat together in the garden, Chloe proposed an idea that surprised James. I think we should honor Thomas, she said. Not just for us, but for everyone. He deserves to be remembered. James's brow furrowed, uncertainty flickering across his face. How? What could we possibly do? He asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Chloe leaned forward, her gaze steady. We can share his story. Not the pain, but the love. The way he connected us. James was silent for a long moment, his hands resting on the edge of the table. He had spent years keeping his pain private, convinced that no one else could understand it. But now, with Chloe beside him, the idea of opening up felt less daunting. If you think it's the right thing to do, he said finally, "I'll trust you." Over the next few days, Chloe and James worked together to plan a small gathering in the garden. Chloe spoke to the villagers, sharing glimpses of Thomas's story, his kindness, his struggles, and the way he had touched the lives of those who knew him. At first, the villagers were hesitant, but as word spread, their curiosity grew. Slowly, people began to see James not as a recluse but as a father who had endured unimaginable loss. Mateo played a vital role in preparing for the event. The boy's youthful enthusiasm brought energy to the project, whether he was planting new flowers or helping arrange the letters and photographs into a small display. "This is going to be amazing," Mateo said one afternoon, wiping dirt from his hands. James glanced at him, a hint of a smile on his face. "You're more optimistic than I am, kid," he said, though there was a warmth in his tone. When the day of the gathering arrived, the garden had been transformed. Flowers bloomed in vibrant colors, and a small tree planted in Thomas's memory stood at the center, its young branches reaching skyward. Villagers trickled in, some bringing gifts of their own, homemade pastries, potted plants, and handwritten notes of support. James stood at the edge of the garden, his heart pounding as he watched the once hostile community come together. Chloe opened the gathering with a heartfelt speech, her voice steady but emotional. She spoke of Thomas, of his love for those around him, and of the ways he had shaped her life. "This garden is a reflection of who he was," she said. "It's a place of growth, resilience, and connection. Just like Thomas was to us." James hesitated before stepping forward. Public speaking was far from his comfort zone, but as he looked at the faces around him, he felt a quiet strength building inside. "I thought I'd lost everything," he began, his voice rough but sincere. "But this garden, and all of you being here, has shown me that we can rebuild, even from the hardest places." The gathering ended as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden light over the garden. Villagers lingered, exchanging stories and laughter. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of belonging he had long thought impossible. Chloe stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the tree planted in his son's memory. "Yes," he replied. "Just the beginning." In the days following the gathering, James's garden became a beacon for the village. What had once been a solitary refuge now teemed with life. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged James before stopped by to admire the flowers, ask for gardening tips, or simply share a kind word. Though hesitant at first, James slowly began to embrace these interactions, each one chipping away at the walls he had built over the years. Chloe visited often, always bringing fresh ideas to expand the garden. "What if we added a section for medicinal plants?" she suggested one morning, her enthusiasm lighting up the quiet space. James chuckled, shaking his head. "You're going to turn this place into a botanical wonderland," he teased. But deep down, he appreciated her ideas and her unwavering presence. Mateo became a regular fixture in the garden, his energy and curiosity breathing new life into the place. "This could be our legacy," he said one afternoon while sketching a new layout for the plants. James watched the boy with a mixture of amusement and pride. "Our legacy, huh? You've got big plans for an old man's garden," he replied, his tone light but affectionate. Not everyone in the village was quick to embrace the changes. Amanda, though less hostile than before, remained distant. One afternoon, she arrived unannounced, a small potted plant in her hands. "I thought this might fit somewhere," she said awkwardly, avoiding James's gaze. Surprised, James accepted the plant, his voice soft. "Thank you. It'll find a good spot here." It wasn't much, but it felt like a step toward something better. The garden wasn't just a place for flowers. It became a place for healing. Villagers began to see it as a space to gather, reflect, and connect. Children played among the paths, elders shared stories under the shade of the newly planted tree, and the community found unity in a place that had once been overlooked. For James, this transformation was both humbling and empowering. Chloe, always perceptive, noticed the quiet confidence growing in James. "You've changed," she said one afternoon as they worked side by side. James paused, wiping his hands on his worn trousers. "I guess I have," he admitted. But I think it's because I've finally stopped hiding. Chloe smiled, her gaze warm. You've always had it in you, James. You just needed the right people to remind you. Despite the progress, James still faced moments of doubt. There were days when the weight of the past threatened to pull him back into isolation. But each time, he found strength in the people around him. Chloe's unwavering support, Mateo's boundless enthusiasm, and the kindness of his neighbors reminded him that he was no longer alone. Chloe proposed an idea that both excited and terrified James, hosting a small gardening workshop for the village. You have so much knowledge to share, she said. James hesitated, the thought of standing in front of a group unnerving. But Mateo's encouragement tipped the scale. Come on, James. You're a natural teacher. Besides, we'll be there with you, the boy said, his grin infectious. The workshop turned out to be a success. Villagers of all ages attended, eager to learn from James's years of experience. As he demonstrated planting techniques and shared tips, he noticed something remarkable. He enjoyed it. The nervousness faded, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in decades. By the end of the day, James stood taller, his smile broader. As the workshop ended and the villagers dispersed, Chloe and Mateo lingered in the garden. See? Chloe said, nudging James playfully. You've got a knack for this? James laughed, shaking his head. Maybe I do, he admitted, a hint of pride in his voice. The three of them sat under the tree, watching the sun set over the garden that had become a symbol of transformation and hope. In the quiet of the evening, James looked around at the vibrant space and the people who had become his family. For the first time in years, he felt not just alive, but truly at peace. The road back had been long and fraught with challenges, but he knew now that it had been worth every step. The days stretched into weeks, and James's transformation continued to ripple through the village. The once reclusive old man was now at the heart of a thriving community, his garden a symbol of resilience and renewal. Villagers came not just to admire the flowers but to share stories, laughter, and even their own struggles. For James, each interaction was a reminder that life, even after years of solitude, could bloom again. Amanda, who had long symbolized the village's indifference, began to soften. One afternoon, she approached James as he tended to a patch of sunflowers. I brought these seeds, she said, her voice hesitant but sincere. Thought they might add something to your garden? James straightened, his gaze meeting hers. Thank you, Amanda. They'll fit right in, he replied, his tone gentle. It was a small moment, but one that signified a shift, an unspoken apology, a tentative truce. Mateo continued to be a constant presence in James's life, his youthful energy filling the garden with laughter and light. You know, James, this place feels like magic, he said one evening as they planted a row of daisies. James chuckled, shaking his head. It's not magic, kid. Just patience and a little care. Mateo grinned. Well, then you're a wizard with patience. Chloe, too, remained by James's side, her support unwavering. She often marveled at how much he had grown, not just the garden, but himself. You've built something incredible here, she said one day, her voice full of admiration. James glanced around, the vibrant blooms and carefully arranged paths a testament to his journey. I didn't do it alone, he replied, his voice filled with gratitude. Despite the progress, James still faced moments of self-doubt. There were times when the old wounds of loss and rejection resurfaced, threatening to pull him back into the shadows. But each time, he found strength in the people who now surrounded him. Chloe's steady encouragement, Mateo's endless optimism, and the villagers' newfound respect reminded him that he was no longer the invisible man he had once been. One afternoon, Chloe suggested they create something permanent to honor Thomas, a memorial that would symbolize his legacy and the connections he had forged between them. What about a tree? She proposed. Something that grows strong and stands tall, like he would have wanted. James nodded, moved by the idea. A tree sounds perfect, he said softly. The day they planted the tree was a turning point for everyone involved. Villagers gathered in the garden, bringing flowers, small mementos, and handwritten notes to place at its base. Chloe spoke first, her voice steady but emotional. This tree represents not just Thomas, but all of us, she said. It's a reminder that even in loss, we can find new beginnings. When it was James's turn to speak, he hesitated. Public words didn't come easily to him, but as he looked at the faces around him, he felt a quiet confidence. "Thomas was my son," he began, his voice rough but steady. "And I thought I'd lost everything when I lost him. But this garden and all of you have shown me that there's always a way forward. Even when it feels impossible." As the tree's roots settled into the earth, so too did a sense of unity within the village. For James, the act of planting it was a resurrection, a reclaiming of life and purpose after years of feeling buried by grief. The villagers lingered long after the ceremony ended, their laughter and conversation weaving a tapestry of connection that James had once thought unattainable. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James sat under the tree with Chloe and Mateo. The young branches swayed gently in the breeze, their movement almost like a whisper of hope. "It feels like a new chapter," Chloe said, leaning back against the trunk. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is," he replied. "For all of us." In that quiet moment, surrounded by the garden that had become a haven for the entire village, James felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: peace. He wasn't just alive, he was living. The man who had once been invisible had found his place in the world again, rooted as firmly as the tree that now stood tall in his garden. The garden had become more than just a place of beauty, it was a sanctuary of connection and healing. People from the village, and even neighboring towns, visited regularly, drawn by its serenity and the story of the man who had created it. James, once invisible and isolated, now stood at the center of a community that valued him for who he was and what he had endured. The transformation was undeniable, not just in the garden, but in himself. One evening, Chloe approached James with an idea. "We should host an annual event here," she said, her excitement evident. "A celebration of growth, resilience, and community." James hesitated, unsure of whether he was ready for such a step. "I'm not much for celebrations," he admitted. Chloe smiled, undeterred. "This isn't just for you, James. It's for everyone who has found hope here." Mateo, always brimming with enthusiasm, jumped at the idea. "We could call it the Garden Festival," he exclaimed, already sketching ideas for decorations. James couldn't help but smile at the boy's infectious energy. All right, he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "But you two are in charge of the planning." The first garden festival was a modest affair, but its impact was profound. Villagers brought flowers, shared homemade treats, and told stories of how the garden had touched their lives. James, though still uncomfortable with the spotlight, found himself moved by the gratitude and warmth that filled the air. As he looked around at the vibrant space he had nurtured, he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. Chloe's role in the festival was pivotal. She spoke passionately about the importance of community and resilience, her words weaving together the threads of James's journey and the village's transformation. "This garden is a reminder that no matter how broken we feel, there's always a way to rebuild," she said, her voice steady and clear. James, listening from the edge of the crowd, felt a swell of pride, not just in the garden, but in the family he had found. As the sun set on the festival, James stood under the tree planted in Thomas's memory. Mateo joined him, holding a small notebook filled with sketches and plans for the garden's future. "You've built something amazing here," the boy said, his tone reverent. James placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder, his voice soft but firm. "We built it," he corrected. Together, the garden and the festival became annual traditions, drawing people from far and wide. It wasn't just about the flowers or the trees, it was about the connections formed within its paths, the stories shared, and the lives changed. For James, it was the elixir he never knew he needed, a sense of purpose and a place where he belonged. Over time, Amanda became a quiet but regular presence in the garden. Though she never spoke much, her actions spoke volumes. She helped plant flowers, tended to the soil, and even baked treats for the festival. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, she turned to James and said, "I'm sorry. For everything." James paused, looking at her for a long moment before replying. "It's never too late to start again," he said simply. The garden flourished with each passing year, its growth mirroring the transformations of those who tended to it. James, once a man burdened by grief and rejection, now walked its paths with a quiet confidence. The brooch, still pinned to his coat, became a symbol of the love and resilience that had carried him through his darkest days. In the quiet moments, when the garden was still, James often found himself reflecting on Thomas. The tree planted in his memory stood tall and strong, its branches reaching skyward as if in defiance of the hardships that had tried to break them. James would sit beneath it, sometimes alone, sometimes with Chloe or Mateo, and feel a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. On one such evening, Chloe joined him under the tree, a cup of tea in her hands. "Do you ever think about what he'd say if he could see this?" she asked, her voice soft. James smiled faintly, his eyes on the horizon. "I think he'd tell us we did all right," he said, "and that he's proud." Chloe nodded, her gaze distant but serene. "I think so too." As the stars emerged, casting a gentle light over the garden, James felt the weight of the past lift just a little more. The man who had once been invisible had found not just a place, but a purpose. Surrounded by the beauty of the garden and the love of those who now called him family, he knew he had finally come home.